The early morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Denver International Airport, casting long, geometric shadows across the gleaming marble floors. Catherine Mills walked through Terminal C with purposeful strides, her worn carry-on bag rolling behind her with a subtle squeak that had become oddly familiar over the past 23 years of constant travel. At 58 years old, she'd flown approximately 2,847 times. She'd actually counted once, somewhere around flight number 2,000, and airports had become more like second homes than destinations. But this morning was different. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours. Her clothes bore the wrinkles of a woman who'd worked through the night in the same outfit, and her faded university sweatshirt, a relic from her Stanford days, featuring the faint outline of a logo that had nearly disintegrated from countless washings, hung loosely over her frame. Her graying hair, which she'd meant to have highlighted last month, was pulled back in what could generously be called a messy ponytail. She wore no makeup, her skin still bearing the faint traces of the stress lines that had deepened over the past 72 hours of negotiations. None of this mattered to Catherine. Appearance had never mattered much to her, and certainly not today. She was riding the high of what would later be described in industry publications as the most consequential aviation investment of the decade. At 11:47 p.m. the previous night, she had successfully closed a $47 million acquisition deal that would fundamentally reshape the trajectory of her company. The negotiations had been brutal. 15 hours of back-and-forth arguments, heated discussions about valuation, threats from both sides to walk away from the table. But Catherine had endured. She always did. And at the moment the other party's CEO had signed the final document, Catherine had felt that familiar rush of victory, the sense that all the sleepless nights and missed dinners and postponed vacations had been worth it. She should have gone home to her hotel and slept. She should have called her assistant and had him book her a later flight. But Catherine had never been someone who dealt well with the aftermath of adrenaline. She needed to move, to keep the momentum going, to transition from one challenge to the next before doubt could creep in. So instead of sleeping, she'd called ahead to Denver International Airport at 5 in the morning and learned that Flight 247 to San Francisco would depart at 7:15 a.m. And yes, she was confirmed in Seat 1A, first class. She'd grabbed her carry-on, the only luggage she'd brought, because Catherine had learned long ago that checked bags were a vulnerability, and headed to the airport in a rideshare. Now, as she made her way through security and into the terminal proper, she felt that bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee could fix. She'd bought an overpriced cappuccino from a chain coffee shop. It tasted like burnt regret, and she was on her second one by the time she approached Gate B-27 for Flight 247. The gate area was already moderately crowded, though the flight wouldn't board for another 45 minutes. Catherine recognized the type immediately. Business travelers, mostly men, in their expensive suits and their leather shoes that probably cost more than her entire outfit. There was a family with 2 young children, the parents looking harried and the kids surprisingly quiet, likely sedated by mobile devices. And there were the others, retirees, leisure travelers, a young woman with a backpack who was probably a college student heading home. Catherine had always been fascinated by airports precisely because of these cross-sections of humanity, these moments where completely different lives intersected in the same space. She approached the gate counter, where a young man in his mid-20s, with the kind of freshly pressed uniform that suggested either recent employment or obsessive attention to detail, was reviewing information on his computer. His name tag read Derek. He had the kind of face that Catherine had learned to read over decades of business interaction, ambitious, not particularly intelligent, and harboring a quiet resentment toward authority. The type of person who followed rules not out of principle, but out of fear of consequence. "Good morning," Catherine said, offering her boarding pass. "I'm confirmed in 1A for today's flight." Derek took the boarding pass, scanned it, and looked at the information on his screen. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Catherine, who had spent her entire career reading subtle micro-expressions, noticed immediately. She felt a small knot begin to form in her stomach, the sensation she'd learned to trust over the years, the feeling that preceded complications. "Okay," Derek said slowly, his fingers moving across the keyboard. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Let me just verify something here." He turned to his supervisor, a woman who appeared to be in her mid-50s, with precisely styled dark hair that had clearly been colored very recently, her makeup applied with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested someone who took pride in her appearance. Her name tag read Patricia, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that came from years of middle management. Patricia was eating a breakfast sandwich from a plastic container, and she set it down somewhat reluctantly before approaching Derek's station. Derek lowered his voice, but not enough to prevent Catherine from hearing. "Flight's overbooked. We need a volunteer to take economy." Patricia looked up from the computer screen, and Catherine watched her gaze travel slowly from Catherine's worn sneakers. They were from a hiking trip 3 years ago, comfortable but definitely not fashionable, up to her sweatshirt, which bore not just the faded Stanford logo, but also what appeared to be a coffee stain from somewhere in the past week. Catherine saw the calculation happen in real time, saw the moment Patricia had made her decision based entirely on appearance. Patricia turned to Catherine with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, we're going to need to make an adjustment to your seating this morning." Catherine felt her shoulders tense. She'd dealt with this before, but never in this context, never in her own airline. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What adjustment?" "Flight 247 is overbooked in first class," Patricia explained, her tone suggesting she was speaking to someone who might not understand the concept of air travel. "We need to move you to economy to accommodate some of our platinum members who had a connection issue. I'm sure you understand. They're regular customers." Catherine understood, all right. She understood that Patricia had looked at her and made a judgment. She understood that Patricia had decided, in the space of 5 seconds, that this particular passenger was expendable, that this particular passenger would be less likely to cause problems or demand answers. "I purchased this ticket 4 months ago," Catherine said quietly, "in first class." "Yes, I understand," Patricia said, and now her voice took on that particular tone that Catherine had learned to recognize over decades, the tone of someone who believed they were dealing with someone unreasonable. "But our policy allows us to reassign seating in cases of overbooking. You should feel lucky that we're able to get you on this flight at all." That word, lucky, hung in the air between them like a challenge. Catherine took a breath, and in that breath she made a decision that would ripple outward in ways she couldn't possibly predict. She decided that she was going to remember every detail of this moment, every word, every look, every dismissal. She was going to understand exactly what kind of problem had been allowed to fester in her company while she wasn't watching. And most importantly, she was going to do something about it. The word hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Lucky. As if Catherine should be grateful for the privilege of being downgraded, as if she should feel fortunate that Patricia had graciously decided to bump her from the first-class cabin she'd paid for months in advance. Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, not anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was something deeper, something that combined humiliation with a cold, precise clarity. She'd spent her entire adult life building respect. She'd earned it through intelligence, through reliability, through making difficult decisions that produced results. She'd never demanded deference, never thrown her weight around, never used her position to intimidate. And yet, in the span of 30 seconds, a woman with a name tag and a breakfast sandwich had decided that Catherine was not worthy of the seat she'd purchased. "I appreciate your concern," Catherine said, keeping her voice steady and professional, "but I'd prefer to keep my first-class seat." That's what I paid for. Patricia's smile tightened. She exchanged a glance with Derek, and Catherine saw something pass between them, a kind of solidarity, the understanding between two people that they were dealing with a difficult customer. Except Catherine wasn't being difficult. She was being reasonable. She was being, in fact, exactly as reasonable as any customer had the right to be. "Ma'am, I understand this is inconvenient," Patricia said, using the tone that medical professionals use with agitated patients. "But it's our policy. If you have concerns, you can address them with customer service after your flight. For now, we need to reassign your seat." "Is the flight actually overbooked, or are you moving me to accommodate Platinum members?" Catherine asked. It was a direct question, asked in a perfectly civil tone, but it seemed to push Patricia past some invisible threshold. "That's none of your concern," Patricia said, her voice cooling dramatically. "You're being difficult and I don't appreciate your attitude. You can either move to economy willingly, or I can have you removed from the flight entirely. Those are your options." Catherine could feel the eyes of other passengers on her now. She could sense their discomfort, the way they were grateful it wasn't them, the way they were already mentally positioning themselves as neutral observers in this conflict. She saw a businessman in a suit glance at her with something approaching pity. She saw the young college student watching with an expression that suggested she was witnessing injustice, but felt powerless to address it. For a moment, Catherine considered asking to speak to the airport manager, filing a formal complaint right there at the gate. But she realized something in that moment. She wasn't going to win this battle. Patricia had already made her decision, and backing down would only validate that decision. Besides, Catherine had something more valuable than winning an argument. Catherine had the ability to remember, to investigate, to understand. "All right," Catherine said quietly. "I'll take the economy seat." She could see the tension drain from Patricia's face, could see the satisfaction there. Patricia had won. She defeated the difficult customer through simple, brute force authority. But Catherine was already thinking past this moment. As Derek guided her toward the gate, Catherine pulled out her phone with the casual deliberateness of someone checking an email. But she wasn't checking email. She was activating her camera. She photographed her boarding pass, making sure the confirmation number was clearly visible. She noted the timestamp. 6:53 a.m. She photographed the gate number sign and the flight information display. She took screenshots of her email confirmation from 4 months ago, the one where she'd purchased the first-class ticket. Then she opened her Notes app and began typing. Derek was explaining something about how her luggage would automatically be transferred, how she didn't need to worry about connections, all the soothing language that gate agents used when they'd just displaced someone from the cabin they'd paid for. Catherine wasn't really listening. She was documenting. Gate agent, Derek Hutchins' name from uniform. Supervisor, Patricia. She paused, looking at Patricia's name tag. Patricia Morrison. Time, 6:53 a.m., Flight 247 to San Francisco. Reason given for downgrade, overbooking. Actual reason, appearance-based discrimination. They selected me for downgrade based on my clothing and appearance, not on any overbooking protocol. She added more details as she made her way through the gate and down the jet bridge. The temperature difference between the gate area and the jet bridge was noticeable, colder, somehow more sterile. She could smell the jet fuel, the particular scent that had become comforting to her over thousands of flights. The flight attendant at the cabin entrance gave her a sympathetic look as Catherine approached, which only confirmed what Catherine had begun to suspect. The crew knew. The crew knew that Patricia had lied about the overbooking. The crew knew that the downgrade had nothing to do with capacity and everything to do with judgment. The first-class cabin appeared as Catherine passed through. She couldn't help but look. Rows of spacious seats, most of them empty. She counted. 1, 2, 3 empty seats in the first-class section. Patricia hadn't lied about the overbooking because of numbers. Patricia had lied because she'd seen Catherine and decided that her appearance didn't warrant a first-class seat. Walking through the premium cabin and into coach felt like an extended humiliation. Every step took her further away from comfort and dignity, and toward the back of the plane where the air was thick with recycled oxygen and the smell of past meals. When she finally reached seat 28F, Catherine understood the full extent of what had happened. The seat was directly next to the lavatory, not just near it, adjacent to it. She would spend 5 hours next to a bathroom that would be flushed repeatedly, that would emit odors with every use, that would create a constant stream of passengers disrupting any attempt at sleep or comfort. A woman in 28E, the window seat, gave Catherine a sympathetic look as she sat down. "That's rough," the woman said quietly. "I saw what happened at the gate." Catherine managed a smile. "It's fine," she said, though they both knew it wasn't. She pulled out her phone again and continued her documentation. She noted the precise time. 6:59 a.m. She noted the seat assignment, the smell of the lavatory, the close quarters. She noted that the first-class cabin had 3 empty seats. She noted Patricia Morrison's name again, underlined it twice. Then something deeper began to settle into Catherine's mind. This wasn't just about Patricia. This was about a system that had allowed Patricia to behave this way 17 times, though Catherine didn't know that number yet, without consequence. This was about a culture at her airline that had somehow developed where gate supervisors felt empowered to make discriminatory decisions based on appearance. Catherine had built her company on meritocracy, on the belief that fair treatment and excellent service were the foundations of success. And yet, while she'd been focused on strategy and expansion, something had rotted at the core. Something toxic had been allowed to grow. The 5-hour flight stretched ahead of her, but instead of the sleep she desperately needed, Catherine knew exactly how she would spend those hours. She would document. She would investigate. She would understand the full scope of what had gone wrong. And then she would make sure it never happened again. The toilet flushed for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, and Catherine didn't even flinch anymore. She'd grown accustomed to the sound within the first hour of the flight, the way it seemed to punctuate her investigation like some cruel narrator commenting on her progress. It was 7:47 a.m. now, and the flight had been airborne for less than 30 minutes. She had 4.5 hours remaining, which felt like both an eternity and barely enough time. Her laptop was open on the tray table, a MacBook Pro that cost more than most people spend on a car, positioned at an angle that allowed her to work while simultaneously ignoring the constant parade of passengers moving past her seat to use the bathroom. The woman next to her, the one who had offered sympathy at the gate, had long since fallen asleep, her head tilted against the window, her gentle snoring providing a strange soundtrack to Catherine's work. Catherine's fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who'd spent decades working on sensitive documents, accessing classified information, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. But right now, those fingers were shaking slightly. She'd logged into her secure corporate network using a VPN connection, something she did approximately twice per year, usually only for true emergencies. The encryption was military grade, the security protocols so extensive that even her IT director didn't fully understand them. Catherine had built her company on the principle that information was power, and she protected her information the way a medieval kingdom protected its gold. The personnel file for Patricia Morrison appeared on her screen in PDF format. Catherine began reading. Hired March 14, 2022. Position: Customer Service Supervisor, Gate Operations, Denver International Terminal. Salary: $58,000 annually. Performance reviews visible. Catherine clicked through them. Meets expectations in the first year. Exceeds expectations in year 2, according to her direct manager. But then Catherine clicked on a subfolder labeled Complaints. 17 files. 17 passenger complaints filed against Patricia Morrison in just over 2 years of employment. 17. Catherine felt her jaw tighten. She opened the first one, dated August 2023. A Mr. James Chen had filed a complaint about being treated disrespectfully when asking for directions to his connecting flight. Patricia's response, filed in the system, customer was confused and argumentative. Standard service provided. The next complaint, from October 2023, a woman named Maria Rodriguez had been downgraded from first class to economy without explanation. Patricia's response, overbooking situation, customer accommodated per policy. Then another. By the seventh complaint, Catherine could see a pattern emerging. The complaints all followed a similar arc. Passengers, mostly women, Catherine noted, and a disproportionate number of them women of color, had been treated dismissively by Patricia. Some had been downgraded, others had been refused boarding, and in at least 2 cases, they'd been threatened with removal if they didn't comply with Patricia's demands. Catherine opened another subfolder and found the incident reports. These were the official documents filed by the airline to explain what had happened on specific flights. She scrolled through them, looking for Flight 247 from this morning. It should have been there. Protocol dictated that any passenger rebooking had to be documented. There it was, filed just an hour after the flight departed. Passenger downgraded due to overbooking. Passenger accepted accommodation without incident. Seat reassigned to premium customer experiencing connection issue. Catherine's hands literally trembled as she read those words. She opened the flight manifest for Flight 247, checking the first-class seating chart. She could see it clearly. Seat 1A was now occupied by someone listed as T. Henderson Priority Rebooking. Seats 1B, 1C, and 1D were empty. Empty. The flight had not been overbooked. Patricia had lied. Catherine opened her own personnel file, the one that appeared under her official corporate title, chairman and majority shareholder. The access to this file required 3 separate passwords and a biometric scan via her phone. Even her CEO, Richard Hansen, didn't have direct access to this information. No one in the company did, except Catherine and her private secretary, Margaret. She pulled up her acquisition history. 7 years ago, she'd purchased a 23% stake in Skyline Airways. 4 years ago, she'd increased that to 51%. 2 years ago, she'd become the official majority shareholder, though only a handful of people at the company level knew it. She appeared in the corporate structure not as Catherine Mills, owner, but as CM Holdings LLC, majority investor. The company had a CEO, a board of directors, multiple layers of management. Catherine existed above all of them, invisible, pulling strings from the shadows. It had always been her preferred way of operating. She'd learned early in her career that visibility was a liability. When people knew who you were, they treated you differently. They made decisions based on your title instead of your merit. They deferred to you in ways that prevented them from showing you the truth. By remaining anonymous, Catherine had been able to observe her companies in their rawest, most authentic state. But that invisibility had a cost. It had meant that while Patricia Morrison was mistreating passengers, while the system was failing to hold her accountable, Catherine had been unaware. She'd been too far removed, too insulated by layers of management to see what was actually happening. The toilet flushed again, and this time Catherine's rage crystallized into something sharper and more dangerous: clarity. She opened a secure messaging application and typed a brief note to her private attorney, Margaret. Emergency. Need complete personnel file on Patricia Morrison, all complaints, all incident reports. Need flight manifest data for all flights Patricia worked in the past 18 months. Need this compiled and analyzed by tonight. Do not flag anyone in HR. Direct access only. Margaret would understand. Margaret had worked with Catherine long enough to know that these kinds of requests didn't come casually. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process what she was discovering. She'd built Skyline Airways into a company she was proud of. She'd made strategic decisions designed to prioritize customer service and employee well-being. And yet, her company was apparently perfectly capable of discriminating against passengers based on appearance. and its systems were designed in such a way that the discrimination was allowed to continue. She thought about all the other passengers who'd experienced what she'd experienced, but without the resources she had. She thought about Maria Rodriguez, about James Chen, about the college-aged girl she'd seen in the airport earlier who'd probably experienced similar treatment, and simply accepted it, the way you accept weather, as something unpleasant but inevitable. Catherine opened her calendar and looked at her schedule. Richard Hansen, the CEO, was available for a video call tomorrow morning. She composed a meeting invitation, customer service crisis discussion, and marked it as priority. Richard would wonder what it was about. He'd probably assume it was some industry trend, some new regulation, some competitive pressure. He would have no idea that she was about to fundamentally restructure his understanding of his own company. As the flight continued westward across the country, Catherine continued her investigation. She cross-referenced complaint data with incident reports. She looked for patterns not just in Patricia's behavior, but in how the complaints were handled. What she found made her blood run cold. The complaints were being processed, but they weren't being escalated. They weren't being tracked as part of an employee's performance record. They were being filed away, acknowledged, and then essentially dismissed. The system was designed, perhaps not intentionally but nonetheless effectively, to allow patterns of misconduct to continue undisturbed. Catherine had built her career on fixing broken systems, and she just discovered that her most important system, the one that affected thousands of customers every single day, was fundamentally broken. The irony was exquisite and terrible. She'd been downgraded to coach so she could see exactly what was wrong with her own airline. Margaret Chen sat at her desk on the 42nd floor of the San Francisco Financial District, overlooking the Bay Bridge, and reread Catherine's message for the third time. She didn't need to read it again. Margaret had understood the first time. But she reread it anyway because rereading it changed nothing about how serious it was. Emergency. Need complete personnel file on Patricia Morrison, all complaints, all incident reports. Need flight manifest data for all flights Patricia worked in the past 18 months. Need this compiled and analyzed by tonight. Do not flag anyone in HR. Direct access only. Margaret had worked as Catherine's private attorney for 15 years. She'd been there when Catherine had fought off hostile takeover attempts, when she'd negotiated acquisition deals that restructured entire divisions of companies, when she'd made decisions that affected the livelihoods of thousands of people. But Margaret had never received a message like this one. Catherine didn't use the word emergency casually. Catherine didn't request direct access only unless she suspected corruption at the highest levels. Margaret was already dialing her contacts in HR before she finished her coffee. The first call was to David Kim, the HR manager at Skyline Airways. Margaret had worked with David on employment contracts and legal compliance issues for 3 years. He was competent, detail-oriented, and most importantly, he owed Catherine a favor from when she'd prevented his job from being eliminated during a restructuring 5 years ago. David, I need some information, and I need you to pull it yourself without notifying anyone else in your department, Margaret said without preamble. I need the complete personnel file for Patricia Morrison, customer service supervisor at Denver International. I need every complaint filed against her, every incident report, and I need the flight manifests for every flight she worked in the past 18 months. This is confidential, and it needs to be done today. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Margaret could practically hear David's internal calculation, the weighing of protocol against the fact that Margaret was Catherine's attorney, and that if Catherine was asking for this information in this way, it was serious. I can do that, David finally said. Give me 3 hours. By 4:47 p.m. Pacific time, Margaret had the information. She opened the files one by one, her jaw tightening as she moved through them. The pattern was impossible to miss once you were looking for it. 17 complaints over the course of 23 months. 17. And yet, Patricia Morrison's personnel file showed only positive performance reviews, only commendations, no disciplinary action whatsoever. Margaret opened the incident reports and began reading them systematically. The first one, from August 2023. Passenger James Chen inquired about connecting flight. Supervisor provided standard information. Customer became argumentative when informed that inquiries should be directed to customer service desk. Supervisor de-escalated situation by reiterating airline policy. No further action taken. Margaret could read between these lines. The passenger had asked a reasonable question. Patricia had treated him poorly. The incident report had reframed the passenger as argumentative to justify Patricia's behavior. The next report, from October 2023. Flight 1847, overbooked in premium cabin. Passenger Maria Rodriguez was offered standard rebooking compensation and agreed to accept economy seat on same flight with $400 travel credit. Passenger seated without incident. Margaret pulled up the flight manifest for that flight. There were 4 empty seats in the premium cabin. The flight had not been overbooked. By the time Margaret had gone through all the incident reports, she'd identified a pattern that was both obvious and deeply troubling. Patricia Morrison had systematically downgraded or mistreated passengers, predominantly women and minorities, and the incident reports had been written in such a way as to justify that treatment retroactively. The reports weren't lying exactly. They were lying by omission, by reframing, by choosing certain details and ignoring others. It was sophisticated corruption, the kind that could continue indefinitely because the paperwork was technically in order. No one reading these reports in isolation would see anything wrong, but taken together, they revealed a supervisor who was operating under the assumption that she could treat certain passengers however she wanted, and that the documentation would protect her. Margaret cross-referenced the flight data with the complaint information and found something even more damaging. In every single case where a passenger had filed a complaint, the incident report had been written in a way that contradicted the complaint. Either the passenger became argumentative, or the flight was overbooked, or the passenger accepted the accommodation without incident. There was no ambiguity here. Either the incident reports were deliberately falsified, or the supervisors writing them were actively colluding to cover up Patricia's misconduct. Margaret's hands literally shook as she compiled everything into a single document. She organized it chronologically, highlighting the contradictions between the passenger complaints and the incident reports. She created a spreadsheet showing the pattern of passengers affected, their demographics, and the nature of the complaints. By the time she was finished, she had a document that was essentially a case file proving systemic discrimination at the gate level. She called Catherine at home, knowing Catherine would still be awake despite the late hour. Catherine had always been someone who slept minimally, someone who seemed to view sleep as a necessary interruption to more important activities. "Tell me," Catherine said without greeting. Margaret could hear the exhaustion in her voice, but underneath it something else, controlled fury. "It's worse than you thought," Margaret said. "This isn't just Patricia. The incident reports have been falsified. Every complaint had a corresponding incident report that contradicted it. Either the flights weren't actually overbooked, or the passengers weren't actually argumentative, or," Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully, "or there's a systemic problem in how incident reports are being written to cover up supervisor misconduct." "How many?" Catherine asked. "In the past 18 months, Patricia Morrison appears in 17 complaints, but I found incident reports from at least 5 other supervisors that follow the same pattern. This isn't an isolated problem, Catherine. This is cultural." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Margaret could imagine Catherine processing this information, understanding the implications, calculating what it meant for her company. "I need everything in a report," Catherine finally said. "Executive summary, detailed findings, recommendations. I need it by tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. You'll have it, Margaret promised. After hanging up, Margaret returned to her research. She spent the next 12 hours compiling the report, cross-referencing data, ensuring that every conclusion she drew was supported by evidence. By 5:47 a.m., she had a 47-page document that constituted essentially a legal indictment of Skyline Airways' customer service operations. The executive summary was damning. Based on analysis of personnel files, passenger complaints, and incident reports, there is probable cause to believe that Skyline Airways customer service supervisors, including but not limited to Patricia Morrison, have engaged in systematic discrimination against passengers based on appearance and demographic characteristics. Additionally, incident reports have been falsified in a manner that suggests deliberate concealment of this conduct. This pattern indicates a systemic failure in oversight, accountability, and compliance with customer service standards. Margaret sent the report to Catherine's personal email at 6:03 a.m. and then went home to sleep, already knowing that Catherine would not have slept, that Catherine would have read every word, that Catherine would be calculating her next move. What neither of them knew yet was that this report would set off a chain of events that would eventually force the entire leadership of Skyline Airways to confront something they'd been avoiding. That culture, not systems, was what actually determined how companies treated people. And that fixing culture required more than policy changes. It required accountability. It required consequences. Richard Hansen had no idea who he was about to meet. He arrived at the video conference room on the executive floor of Skyline Airways headquarters in San Francisco at exactly 10:00 a.m., carrying his iPad and a cup of coffee from the executive lounge. The calendar invitation had said Customer Service Crisis Discussion, which Richard had initially interpreted as a routine quarterly briefing, possibly about some new regulation or a competitive threat from United or Southwest. Skyline Airways was a smaller regional carrier, and there was always some crisis or other that required discussion. But as Richard settled into his chair and the video call connected, something in the atmosphere shifted. He saw Catherine Mills, a woman he'd met exactly twice before, both times in formal board settings where she'd barely spoken, sitting in what appeared to be a home office, her expression completely neutral. "Richard," Catherine said, "thank you for making time on short notice." "Of course," Richard replied, attempting to match her tone. "I understand there are some customer service concerns we need to address." Catherine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled her laptop closer and turned it so that the camera captured her screen. Richard could see what appeared to be a personnel file. His stomach tightened slightly. "I experienced an incident yesterday morning," Catherine said, her voice perfectly level, "on Flight 247 from Denver to San Francisco. I was downgraded from first class to economy by two of your employees, Derek Hutchins and Patricia Morrison. I'd like you to walk me through what happened." Richard's mind raced. The woman in the faded sweatshirt. He suddenly remembered the incident. There had been a complaint filed, he thought, something about an overbooking situation. He'd probably gotten an email about it that he'd delegated to someone in customer service. "I can look into that for you," Richard began, but Catherine cut him off. "Don't look into it," she said. "Look at this." She turned her laptop back toward the camera, and Richard could see a document titled Customer Service Systemic Failure Analysis. It appeared to be extensive, professional, legally thorough. Catherine began to scroll through it. "Patricia Morrison has 17 complaints filed against her in the past 23 months, Catherine said, reading directly from the report. 17, yet her performance reviews show her as exceeding expectations. She's received no disciplinary action whatsoever. Do you know why?" Richard didn't answer. He was beginning to understand that this was not a routine briefing. "Because the incident reports that document her conduct have been falsified," Catherine continued. She downgraded me to accommodate, as she put it, premium customers. The flight wasn't overbooked, Richard. I've seen the manifest. There were 3 empty seats in first class. Richard felt his mouth go dry. Catherine, Flight 247 was not an isolated incident, Catherine interrupted, her voice still perfectly calm, which somehow made it more terrifying than if she'd been shouting. Patricia Morrison followed the exact same pattern in 16 previous incidents. She selected passengers based on appearance, downgraded them, and then lied about the reason. And every time she lied, someone in your organization documented that lie as if it were fact. She scrolled to another page. I've also identified 5 other supervisors who appear to follow the same pattern. This isn't a problem with Patricia Morrison, Richard. This is a problem with your company. This is a problem with a culture that has decided that certain customers are acceptable targets for discrimination. Richard could feel his heart pounding. I had no idea this was happening, if I'd known. I know you didn't know, Catherine said, and there was something almost worse about her calm acknowledgement than if she'd accused him directly. That's the problem. You're the CEO of my airline, and you didn't know that your gate supervisors were systematically discriminating against passengers. That's a failure of oversight. That's a failure of leadership. Richard sat in stunned silence. My airline. She'd said my airline, not our airline or the airline. The realization crashed over him like a wave. You own Skyline Airways, he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. I own majority interest in Skyline Airways, Catherine confirmed. I've owned it for 7 years, though few people at your management level have known that. I've remained deliberately invisible because I wanted to see what you do when you think nobody important is watching. The irony of that statement hung in the air between them. Richard had been performing competence for the entire board meeting, presenting quarterly metrics and growth projections and strategic initiatives, all while the actual owner of the company had been systematically discovering how badly the company was being managed at the operational level. I take full responsibility, Richard began, his voice shaking slightly. I can implement new protocols immediately. I can ensure that. This isn't about protocols, Catherine interrupted. Protocols don't fix culture, Richard, and your company has a culture problem. Your company has decided, consciously or unconsciously, that it's acceptable to treat certain people poorly. That decision didn't come from nowhere. That decision came from leadership that either enabled it or ignored it, possibly both. She turned the laptop back around, and now Richard could see her face clearly. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were sharp, focused, absolutely ruthless. Here's what's going to happen, Catherine said. First, Patricia Morrison and Derek Hutchins are terminated effective immediately. No severance, no positive references. Their conduct was discriminatory and involved deliberate falsification of company documents. Second, I want a full external audit of every customer service interaction conducted in the past 5 years. Third, I want new training programs implemented across the entire company, focusing on dignity and respect. Fourth, I want to understand how someone could file 17 complaints and face no consequences. That tells me your entire supervisory structure is broken. Richard nodded, unable to find words. I'm also bringing in an external consultant, Catherine continued. Someone I trust completely. Your job is to cooperate fully with that consultant. Your job is to stop defending your department and start defending your company's values. Because if you're defending Patricia Morrison's right to discriminate against passengers, then you're not defending my company. You're defending something toxic. I'm not defending her, Richard said quickly. I would never. You didn't even know she was doing it, Catherine said, and that simple statement was somehow more damning than any accusation. Which is either negligence or willful ignorance. Either way, it has to change. She leaned back in her chair, and Richard could see the exhaustion in that movement. I want a full compliance report by Monday morning. I want to know who knew what when, and why no action was taken. I want to understand every step from complaint filing to documentation to resolution. And I want to understand why Patricia Morrison still had a job after the fifth complaint. You'll have everything, Richard promised. Good, Catherine said. She paused, and for a moment something that might have been compassion flickered across her face. I'm not trying to destroy your career, Richard, but I am going to destroy whatever has allowed this to happen. If you're part of the solution, you'll be fine. If you're part of the problem, you'll be gone. Understand? I understand, Richard said quietly. Then we're done here, Catherine said, and the video feed cut off, leaving Richard alone in the conference room with his coffee growing cold and the terrible understanding that everything had just changed. By 2:15 p.m. on Monday, Patricia Morrison's access badge no longer worked. By 3:47 p.m., Derek Hutchins received a termination letter from HR delivered by security escort. By end of business that same day, every manager at Skyline Airways had received a notification that a full external audit of customer service operations was being initiated, effective immediately. The shock rippled through the company like an electrical current. Richard Hansen had spent the entire weekend compiling the compliance report Catherine had demanded. He discovered things that made his stomach turn. Patricia's 17 complaints weren't anomalies. They were part of a broader pattern. In total, the audit had identified 43 complaints across 9 different supervisors over the past 3 years. 43. And in every single case, the complaint documentation had been handled in a way that minimized accountability. But worse than the numbers was what Richard discovered about himself. He'd received at least 6 emails about customer service issues in the past year. 6. He delegated all of them to his customer service director, assuming they were being handled. He'd never followed up. He'd never asked questions. He'd trusted a system that was fundamentally broken. The external auditor arrived on Tuesday morning. Her name was Dr. Elena Vasquez, and she was a renowned expert in organizational behavior and corporate culture. Catherine had worked with Elena before, and she trusted Elena completely. Elena was the kind of consultant who didn't accept comfortable lies. She asked hard questions and followed the evidence wherever it led. Elena spent the first week conducting interviews. She talked to gate agents, flight attendants, supervisors, and managers. She reviewed 5 years of incident reports. She analyzed complaint data, and what she discovered was that the problem went deeper than anyone had anticipated. The gate agents, the people actually interacting with customers, knew about Patricia's behavior. Some of them had reported her. Others had remained silent, figuring it wasn't their problem. None of them had expected the company to actually take action. That was the real cultural problem. A belief that the system was rigged, that complaints went nowhere, that accountability was something that happened to other companies. By the following Monday, Elena had a presentation ready for the executive team. She sat across from Richard, Catherine, who had decided to attend in person, making her first physical appearance at headquarters since becoming majority shareholder, and the board of directors. Your company has a trust crisis, Elena began without preamble. Your employees don't trust that complaints will be taken seriously. Your customers don't trust that they'll be treated fairly. Your managers don't trust that policies will actually be enforced. In that environment, people like Patricia Morrison thrive, because the cost of bad behavior is essentially zero. She pulled up a slide showing the complaint data. You've had a consistent pattern where complaints are filed, documented, and then filed away. There's no follow-up. There's no escalation. There's no consequence. That sends a very clear message. We don't actually care. Catherine watched Richard's face as he absorbed this. He was a good manager in many ways, but he'd been insulated from the reality of his own company. What would fix this? Richard asked, his voice tight. Culture change, Elena said. Real culture change, not the kind that comes from a memo or a training video. The kind that comes from leadership taking accountability, from policies actually being enforced, from consequences being real. You need to show your employees that you mean it. Catherine spoke for the first time. I'm implementing several changes immediately, she said, and Richard noticed that she didn't say we or I recommend. She said, I'm implementing. First, there will be a mandatory all-hands meeting on Friday. I'll be addressing the entire company. Second, I'm bringing in new training programs that will begin next month, mandatory for every employee. Third, I'm implementing a new customer service oversight system that tracks complaints and holds supervisors accountable. And fourth, every manager at this company, from the CEO down to supervisors, will work at least one flight shift per quarter. They're going to see what it's like to be a customer of Skyline Airways. Richard nodded. He understood what she was doing. She was showing, not telling, that things had changed. Friday morning, 573 employees of Skyline Airways logged into a video conference. They represented gate agents, flight attendants, supervisors, managers, and back-office staff. They had no idea why they were being called to an all-hands meeting. The company rarely did them. Catherine appeared on screen, and there was an immediate ripple of confusion. Most of the employees didn't know who she was. They might have recognized her name from the corporate structure somewhere, but she was not a visible presence in the company. My name is Catherine Mills, she said simply. I own Skyline Airways. I own the majority stake in this company, and I want to talk to you about something that has been happening here that I only discovered last week. The screen went silent. Employees leaned closer to their monitors. Catherine explained the situation methodically. She talked about her experience on Flight 247. She talked about Patricia Morrison's 17 complaints. She talked about the falsified incident reports. She talked about the systemic failure to hold people accountable. And most importantly, she talked about what that meant. I own this company, Catherine said, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that you work here, that you spend 8 to 12 hours a day in this environment. And what you deserve is to work somewhere that respects people, both customers and employees. Patricia Morrison treated customers poorly and nobody stopped her. That's not just Patricia's failure. That's all of our failure. That's a company failure. She paused, letting that sink in. Starting today, things are different. Patricia Morrison and Derek Hutchins have been terminated. Their conduct was unacceptable and it will not be tolerated. But more importantly, we're implementing new systems. Every complaint will be tracked. Every supervisor will be held accountable. And you, every single one of you, will have a way to report problems that actually results in action. Catherine announced the new training programs, the oversight systems, the mandatory flight shifts for management. She talked about dignity and respect, not as abstract concepts but as concrete values that would guide decision-making. I became aware of this problem, Catherine concluded, only because I experienced it personally. And I want to be clear, you shouldn't have to be the owner of a company to be treated with respect. Every customer of Skyline Airways deserves that respect. Every employee deserves to work in an environment where bad behavior has consequences. That's not a luxury. That's a baseline. The impact was immediate and profound. Within weeks, the culture of Skyline Airways began to shift. Employees started reporting problems, knowing that reports would be taken seriously. Supervisors became more careful about their conduct, understanding that there was actual oversight. Managers who participated in mandatory flight shifts came back from those flights with new perspective on what customers experienced. The most remarkable change, though, was something Alina had predicted. Trust returned. Not instantly, not completely, but gradually. Employees began to believe that the company actually cared about doing the right thing. And when employees believe that, they invest themselves more fully in their work. Within 3 months, customer satisfaction scores had increased by 11 percentage points. Within 6 months, complaints about gate operations had dropped by 67%. Within a year, Skyline Airways had become known in the industry not just for good prices and convenient routes, but for something rarer, a genuine commitment to treating people well. The story of Catherine Mills, the woman who owned the airline and had been forced to downgrade to economy to discover what was wrong with her company, spread through the aviation industry like a legend. Other airlines began studying what Skyline Airways had done. Some tried to implement similar changes. The industry itself began to shift, just slightly, toward the belief that culture actually mattered. Catherine had fixed her broken company, not through policy alone, but through something more fundamental. She'd made accountability real. Patricia Morrison sat in the coffee shop for 47 minutes before Catherine arrived. She'd chosen the location deliberately, a small cafe near San Francisco Bay, far enough from the airport that she wouldn't run into anyone from her former company, but close enough that Catherine could make it work into her schedule. Patricia had lost weight since her termination 3 months ago. Her face had a gaunt quality to it, and her hands trembled slightly as she held her untouched latte. She'd been fired 3 months to the day. The termination letter had been efficient and brutal. Effective immediately, your employment with Skyline Airways is terminated for systematic misconduct, discrimination against passengers, and falsification of company documents. You will receive no severance. You may not use this company as a reference. The months that followed had been the most difficult of Patricia's life. She'd applied to other airlines, only to discover that word had spread. No one wanted to hire the gate supervisor who'd been terminated by Skyline Airways for discrimination. She tried to get other types of jobs, retail, customer service, administrative work, but employers conducted background checks, and the termination was there, impossible to hide. More painful than the job loss, though, was the thinking. Patricia had spent 3 months in what she could only describe as psychological reckoning. She'd looked back at her 17 complaints, at each passenger she'd treated poorly, and she'd been forced to confront something she'd been avoiding her entire career. She'd become a person who hurt people. When the email had arrived from a woman named Catherine Mills requesting a meeting, Patricia's first instinct had been to refuse. What good could come from it? Catherine Mills had fired her. Catherine Mills had publicly revealed her misconduct to the entire company. Catherine Mills had made it impossible for Patricia to get a job anywhere in the aviation industry. But Patricia had decided, perhaps for the first time in her life, to do the hard thing instead of the easy thing. Catherine arrived at 3:14 p.m., exactly 14 minutes late, which Patricia understood was intentional, a subtle assertion of power, a reminder of hierarchy. Catherine looked different in person than she had on the video conference. She looked older, less polished, more human. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her gray hair pulled back simply. She ordered a black coffee at the counter without looking at the menu, then sat across from Patricia at a small table near the window overlooking the bay. "Thank you for meeting me," Patricia said immediately before Catherine could speak. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I should," Catherine replied, her tone neutral. She sipped her coffee, and Patricia realized she was being evaluated, assessed, measured. "I want to apologize," Patricia began, her voice shaking slightly. "Not because I was fired, not because it's convenient. I want to apologize because I've spent the past 3 months thinking about what I did, and I can't believe—" She stopped, unable to continue. "Can't believe what?" Catherine asked. "I can't believe how cruel I was," Patricia said quietly. "How systematically cruel, not just to you, to 17 other people, to people I'll never meet, whose lives I affected negatively, whose days I made worse. I was a supervisor at an airline, which means I had power over people in a vulnerable moment, and I used that power to hurt them." Catherine didn't respond immediately. She looked out the window at the bay, and Patricia could see something shift in her expression, a softening, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. "Why did you do it?" Catherine asked. It was a simple question, But it required Patricia to examine something she'd been avoiding even in her 3 months of reckoning. "I was angry," Patricia said slowly. "I've been angry for years. My marriage fell apart. My kids didn't want to see me. I was stuck in a job that paid reasonably well but felt meaningless. I was 53 years old and felt like my entire life was a failure. And so when I saw people who looked happy, who looked successful, who looked like they had things I didn't have," Patricia paused, "I took it out on them. I had power over them in that moment and I used it." She looked directly at Catherine for the first time. "I didn't know who you were. I treated you that way because I didn't know you mattered. And I'm asking myself now," Patricia's voice cracked, "why does it matter more because you own an airline? Why didn't it matter when you were just a tired woman trying to get home?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and precise. "The answer to that question," Catherine said, "is that it should have mattered equally. That's the entire point. Every person deserves dignity, not because of what they do or what they own or how they look, because they're a human being, and you violated that, not just with me, with everyone you treated that way." Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "I know, I understand that, and I'm asking," she stopped, unable to articulate what she was asking for. "Are you asking for forgiveness?" Catherine asked. "I'm asking for a chance to not be that person anymore," Patricia said. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I lost my career. I know I deserve that, but I'm asking for a chance to become someone different." Catherine set her coffee cup down carefully. "I fired you because your behavior was unacceptable, and your presence in my company was preventing the kind of culture I'm trying to build. That was necessary. I don't regret it." Patricia felt her heart sink. She'd known intellectually that there might not be redemption available, but she'd hoped. "However," Catherine continued, "I do believe in second chances, not for your sake but for the sake of the person you might become. And I think you're asking the right questions now. I think you're beginning to understand something important." Catherine pulled out her phone and typed something quickly. "I'm connecting you with a therapist named Dr. Marcus. He specializes in helping people process anger and rebuild their lives. I'm paying for 6 months of sessions. You're going to go, and you're going to do the work." Patricia couldn't speak. "I'm also connecting you with a training program," Catherine continued. "It's called the Second Chance Career Initiative. They work with people who have had professional setbacks to help them rebuild. They'll help you find work and they'll provide training. You're going to get a job, but not in aviation. Somewhere else. Somewhere new." "Why are you doing this?" Patricia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because," Catherine said, "you've acknowledged what you did. You're asking the hard questions. And because I believe that the measure of a person isn't their worst moment, but whether they're willing to change. You might be willing to change. If you are, I want to give you that opportunity." She leaned forward slightly. "But understand something clearly. If you use this opportunity to hurt someone else, if you use this second chance to go back to who you were before, there won't be a third chance. The next consequences will come from somewhere else. From the universe, from fate, from your own conscience. I won't protect you again. Understand?" "I understand," Patricia said. "Good," Catherine said. She finished her coffee. "Dr. Marcus is expecting your call. The training program director is expecting your application. You have a chance to build a different life. What you do with that is up to you." She stood to leave, then paused. "The thing that surprised me most about discovering what was happening at my company," Catherine said, "was that I realized my invisibility had allowed it. I wasn't paying attention. I was too insulated. So in a strange way, being downgraded to economy next to a lavatory was a gift. It forced me to see what was really happening." She looked at Patricia directly. "Maybe losing your job is a gift too. Maybe it's forcing you to see what you've become, so you can decide who you want to be instead. I hope so." Catherine walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Patricia alone with her tears and a phone number for Dr. Marcus, and the terrifying possibility of redemption. Patricia sat for another hour looking out at the bay, and for the first time in years she felt something that wasn't anger or bitterness or resentment. She felt hope, and she understood finally that Catherine Mills hadn't forgiven her, but she'd offered her something more valuable, the chance to forgive herself. 1 year after the incident on Flight 247, Catherine Mills sat across from James Patterson, the editor of Aviation Weekly, and made a decision that would fundamentally change how the aviation industry thought about itself. "I want to tell you the whole story," Catherine said, "not to blame anyone, not to take credit, but because I think there's something important in this story that the industry needs to hear." James had covered aviation for 32 years. He'd written about mergers and bankruptcies and technological innovations, but he'd never written about something like this. An owner who'd been discriminated against by her own company, who'd uncovered systemic corruption, and who'd chosen to use her power not for revenge but for transformation. The article, titled "What a First-Class Downgrade Taught a CEO About Leadership," was 8,000 words of carefully crafted narrative. Catherine walked James through the entire experience. The morning at Denver International, the documentation on the 5-hour flight, the investigation that revealed 17 complaints against Patricia Morrison, the meeting with Richard Hansen, and the systemic changes that followed. But more importantly, she talked about what she'd learned. "I built my company on merit," Catherine explained in the article, "on the belief that fairness and excellence were the foundations of success, but I also built my company in a way that insulated me from reality. I was invisible, and in my invisibility, I allowed a culture of casual cruelty to develop. A gate supervisor could discriminate against passengers based on appearance and nobody stopped her. Why? Because nobody important was watching, or so everyone thought." Catherine talked about Patricia, though she didn't use her full name. She talked about how Patricia's 17 complaints should have been 17 warnings, how the system had failed to protect passengers by failing to hold supervisors accountable. "But here's what I want people to understand," Catherine continued. "The person who discriminated against me didn't wake up one morning and decide to become cruel. Patricia Morrison became cruel because she was angry, because her life had been difficult, because she had access to power in a moment when customers were vulnerable. That's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. And understanding the explanation is the only way to prevent it from happening again." The article went viral. Within 48 hours, it had been shared by over 1 million people. It appeared on the front page of business publications. Universities began using it in business school case studies. Companies across industries started citing it as a model for how to address systemic problems. But more importantly, something unexpected happened. People started paying attention to how they were being treated by service workers. Passengers began recording interactions at airports. They began filing complaints more frequently because they believed the complaints would actually matter. And across the aviation industry, companies began implementing changes based on what Skyline Airways had done. Better tracking of complaints, more accountability for supervisors, more investment in customer service training. By the end of that year, the culture of the industry had begun to shift. Not dramatically, culture changes slowly, but noticeably. Skyline Airways became known not just as a good airline, but as an airline with values. Employee satisfaction scores tripled. Customer satisfaction scores increased by 23 percentage points. Most remarkably, the company began attracting talented people who wanted to work for an organization that treated people with respect. Richard Hansen, who Catherine had threatened with termination, instead became one of the most vocal advocates for cultural change in the industry. He gave speeches at aviation conferences about accountability and leadership. He worked with other CEOs to implement similar oversight systems. He became, in essence, the public face of what systemic accountability could look like. Patricia Morrison, meanwhile, had something quite different happen to her. She'd started therapy with Dr. Marcus in the weeks after her meeting with Catherine. The first months were painful. Patricia had to confront not just her behavior with passengers, but the deeper rage and disappointment that had driven that behavior. She'd lost her marriage because she was bitter about life. She'd damaged relationships with her children because she was angry at them for not understanding her suffering. She destroyed her career by taking out her anger on strangers. But slowly, with professional help and genuine commitment to change, Patricia had begun to rebuild. She'd completed the Second Chance Career Initiative training program. She'd learned new skills, and through a connection from the program, she'd found work at a nonprofit organization that helped people transition out of career burnout. It paid less than her gate supervisor job, but it was meaningful in a way that her airline career had never been. She'd also slowly began to repair her relationships with her children. She'd apologized to them, not a quick apology but a real, sustained acknowledgement of how her bitterness had affected them. Her youngest daughter had, tentatively, agreed to have lunch with her. It was a beginning. What Patricia didn't know was that Catherine had quietly paid for her therapy sessions for 2 years beyond that initial 6 months. Catherine didn't publicize this. She didn't tell the story to James Patterson. It was between her and Patricia, a private understanding that second chances were possible, even for people who'd caused real harm. 10 years after the incident on Flight 247, Catherine sat in her office overlooking San Francisco Bay and reflected on what had happened. Skyline Airways had become the most respected airline in the industry. It wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the cheapest, but it was the airline people chose when they cared about being treated well. The all-hands meeting she'd given, where she'd revealed her identity and commitment to cultural change, had become something of a legend in business circles. Business schools showed it in their ethics classes. Management consultants referenced it as an example of authentic leadership. And it had all started because she'd been downgraded to a seat next to a lavatory. Catherine continued to fly, always in economy when traveling alone, never revealing herself, never asking for upgrades. The employees of Skyline Airways had learned her story, and they worked each day with the understanding that anyone could be Catherine Mills, that anyone deserved dignity, that how you treated people when you thought nobody important was watching was actually the most important moment of all. She thought often about that moment at Denver International when Patricia had looked at her and made a judgment based on appearance. She thought about how that moment of cruelty had led to systemic change. She thought about how Patricia, despite everything, had managed to rebuild her life. Most of all, she thought about the lesson that expensive first-class ticket had taught her, that the true measure of a company isn't what it looks like when the boss is watching. It's what it looks like when nobody thinks anyone important is paying attention. Because in the end, everyone is important. The young gate agents starting their first day at Skyline Airways would learn this from their training, would hear the story of Catherine Mills and Patricia Morrison, would understand that treating every passenger with dignity wasn't a corporate policy. It was a commitment to human worth. 23,000 passengers flew Skyline Airways every single day. 23,000 opportunities to treat someone with respect or disrespect. 23,000 moments where an employee could choose to see a person or see a problem to be solved. Catherine had made one choice, to document her humiliation rather than accept it. That single choice had rippled outward, changing thousands of lives, transforming an industry and proving something that needed proving. That individual integrity, when combined with systemic accountability, could create real, lasting change. As Catherine looked out at the Bay Bridge, she thought about all the places in the world where similar stories were likely unfolding, where passengers were being mistreated, where systems were failing, where cruelty was being tolerated. She thought about how change happened one person at a time, one moment at a time, one decision at a time. And she thought about Patricia, probably somewhere in the city, probably helping someone else navigate a difficult transition, probably thinking sometimes about that moment when her life had been about to get worse before it got better. In the end, that was the real legacy. Not that an airline had been transformed, but that a woman who'd made terrible choices had been given the space to become someone better, and that an industry had learned that treating people well wasn't a luxury. It was the point. It was always the point. The end.